These are tips and tricks for Aetherdrift Draft that will help you find more success in your events. First, play more creatures. There are tons of vehicles in this set, and while they have power and toughness on the cards, which makes them look very similar to creatures, you need to make sure you have enough creatures to actually crew them, because the nightmare scenario is having a bunch of vehicles in play, no creatures, and your opponent just attacks past all of your empty vehicles. Sometimes you're going to have to pass up on those sweet air response units and just play a daring mechanic instead. Next, know your role. The card Kalorna, Coral Tyrant, really emphasizes this and hammers it home in this set because it's a 2-mana 0/8. It's an absolute stats monster, but it doesn't attack. All it does is block and hold the ground and stall the game, so if you are playing a late game deck, you can win the late game. The problem is if you play Kalorna in a random deck where your opponent has a better late game than you, then all you've done is helped your opponent out because they don't really care that you have a 2-mana 0/8. They're trying to get to the late game too, and their late game, they think at least, is better than yours. So if you are going to be putting a card like Kalorna in your deck, you need to be sure that you have at least a decent or very high chance of winning in the late game, because that is exactly what this card is trying to do. On the flip side, there are some cards that only go in aggressive decks, and you want to make sure that if you're putting them in your deck, they only go into aggressive roles. But Kalorna is the best example of this because there are some cases where I'm very happy if I see my opponent play Kalorna because I'm just like, phew, they're not pressuring me, and now I can beat them in the late game where I think my late game is better than theirs. Next, evaluating max speed cards. These cards can be tricky, so here are some tips. First, ask yourself, does it get me to max speed? Second, ask yourself, is the card good without max speed? And third, is the card good with max speed? That's the order that you want to be looking at them with. Let's go through some examples. Gastel Thrillseeker is the perfect card for max speed. Does it get you to max speed? Well, you play it on turn 2, it pings your opponent, gets you 2 of the 4 to max speed all by itself on turn 2. That's pretty dang good. Next, is the card good without max speed? Well, it's a 2-mana 2/3, so that's pretty good. And 3, is the card good with max speed? Adding Death Touch and Haste to it definitely makes it more relevant in the late game. So all 3 of these, it gets a yes. This card is quite good for max speed. Now, second, Leonin Surveyor. Is this card going to get you to max speed? Well, it comes down on turn 2. It attacks pretty well with first strike on your turn. It's probably pretty good at getting you towards max speed. Second, is the card good without max speed? Well, most of the utility of the card comes from the fact that it's going to be a 2-mana 2/2 first striker attacking in the early turns, so it's pretty good without max speed. And then 3, is it good with max speed? Well, it gets you some card advantage late. So this card's pretty good. Not as good as the Gastel Thrillseeker we just looked at, but still a pretty good card on all of these metrics. Next, Risen Necroregent. This card is a 5-mana 5/4, so it doesn't really help you get to max speed because by the time it comes down, the board is likely to be stalled, your opponent's going to have some blockers, so you kind of want to have max speed already. So it's kind of a fail on that first one. Is the card good without max speed? Well, it's a 5-mana 5/4, so a bit understated for what you would normally get these days for 5 mana. Is the card good with max speed? Absolutely fantastic. It can just win you the game on its own pretty much if you have max speed. So this is another good card because it's so good in that third category that it's worth the sacrifice of the first 2 categories. Final card we're looking at here, Aether Siphon. Does it get me to max speed? Well, not really at all. It doesn't have attacking or blocking stats. It just is an artifact that comes into play, so it doesn't help you get to max speed at all. 2, is the card good without max speed? Not really. I mean, 3 mana to draw, 3 mana to play that does nothing, then pay 2 mana to draw a card. Sure, in some situations you can build a deck around this sort of effect where you just put a lot of cards like Kalorna that we talked about earlier into your deck to stall the game and then try to win with an Aether Siphon, but it doesn't exactly do a ton on its own. It's very inefficient card draw that you're going to kind of have to really work towards making actually be playable in your deck. And then 3, is the card good with max speed? Well, it can be an alternate win condition, but a lot of the time, by the time you've gotten to a spot where you've stabilized and have drawn enough cards with Aether Siphon that the max speed is on, you're going to be able to win with the card advantage you've accrued instead of having to rely on mill, though it is certainly upside. So this is the sort of card that's not really a priority in your draft because it doesn't really fit any of these criteria for max speed that are going to help you actually get to max speed, use max speed well, or advance your game plan for max speed. Next, you don't need speed for the sake of speed. So we just talked all about these max speed cards. You don't need to prioritize speed if you don't have a reason to, like that Risen Necroregent we talked about. So a card like Loxodon Surveyor, if that is the only speed card in your deck, it's probably not worth playing because you're just going to put this card into play. Maybe eventually you'll get to max speed, but you're not really building around it and the payoff isn't super worth it. So you're basically just putting a vanilla 3-mana 3/3 into your deck at that point, which isn't something you'll often want to be doing because you'll have better options. So keep that in mind as well when looking at speed cards. Next, direct damage makes low life dangerous. This is a set that does have lightning strike at common. So if you're playing against a red opponent and they make an attack that looks a little bit suspicious, that will take you to 3 life. Do everything in your power to stay out of 3 life in a lot of cases, unless of course you can't win otherwise. But keeping above that 3 life threshold, really important. There's also direct damage from random cards like Risky Shortcut, which are going to deal 2 damage to each player. Because that the wave speed goes up is by having players lose life on your turn, there are direct damage effects like Risky Shortcut that make a low life total especially dangerous. And then of course there's the card Haunt the Network, which is absolutely devastating and can take you out from a really high life total if your opponent just has a bunch of artifacts in play and are just sitting there trying to stall the game and build up their board state and all of those things. So if you have a low life total, try to end the game. Try to put some pressure on your opponent so you don't just lose out of nowhere to a card like Haunt the Network when you thought you were in a winning position. Next, hold an extra card against black decks. This one's pretty simple. Ripclaw Wrangler is in this format, so if you have a really important card that you don't have an opportunity to deploy yet, maybe a removal spell or something of that nature where your opponent hasn't played something big to kill yet, just hold that extra land if possible, because you don't want to just have it nabbed by a Ripclaw Wrangler. That's one of those things that's always worth checking in any format if there's a really playable discard effect, and Ripclaw Wrangler certainly meets that criteria. Next, the vehicle blocking trick. This one's a little bit more complex, but I wanted to get some more advanced tips in here as well. Here's a situation you may find yourself in. Your opponent is attacking you with a large creature, let's just say a migrating Tetradon, so it's a 6/6. You're in chump blocking mode, maybe you win on the next turn of combat, and you have a chump blocking creature all lined up. Your Sundial Dawn Tyrant is going to jump in front of the Tetradon to try and save your life total to win you the game. You also have a Ripclaw Wrangler, which is a vehicle that you could crew up and chump block with in an alternate scenario so that you don't have to lose your Sundial Dawn Tyrant. Now, unbeknownst to you, your opponent has a lightning strike. So, in the first scenario, if you crew up that Ripclaw Wrangler trying to block the migrating Tetradon, which is your dream scenario, your opponent can actually kill the Ripclaw Wrangler before you get the chance to block. You crew it up, they kill the Ripclaw Wrangler, you take 6 damage from the Tetradon. That is bad news for you. You're going to lose the game. The Tetradon's going to hit you. In this other scenario, if you just go straight to blocking with the Sundial Dawn Tyrant, your opponent doesn't have the opportunity to foil your plans. Because if they try to kill your Sundial Dawn Tyrant, you can crew the Ripclaw Wrangler in response, and then you end up in a situation where you're able to get that chump block off and win the game on the backswing or whatever. Or if you just needed to chump block to try and draw a removal spell or whatever, you end up in the situation where even if they use their lightning strike, you still are able to crew. So that is a really good thing to be aware of. And that's just a vehicle blocking trick where you can almost use the vehicle as an extra blocker if you just are willing to go to blocks with your normal creature first. Next, splashing is very doable in this format. There are lands like Night Market, which is really good because you can choose any color when it comes into play. There is the gain land cycle like Dismal Backwater. There's one for every 10, all 10 2-color pairs, so they can enter, gain you a life, tap for one of 2 colors, and these are really, really critical for fixing, especially in non-green color combos. There's also, if you are going to be splashing, you want to make sure you're splashing high impact cards that have single pip. So in a blue-green deck, splashing red for Loot the Pathfinder is really powerful because it's only a single red pip, really easy to get going. There are double pipped cards like the Gear Hulks that are not recommended to splash because 2 pips is way harder on your mana base than getting just one source of that color, so keep that in mind when determining what you're trying to splash. Next, can your aggro deck beat a 3/3? There are some huge statted creatures, and the first one that comes to mind is Midnight Mangler, where if you play your little 2-mana 2/2 creature and are trying to pressure your opponent, and they play a Midnight Mangler on turn 2, you need to have a plan for that, because a 2-mana 3/3 is not some sort of far-fetched, oh, this is not going to come up. This is a common. This is the sort of thing that you need to be able to deal with game in and game out. If your opponent is playing a defensive deck, they're going to include this sort of card. So that means you need to have combat tricks, removal spells that can interact with it, some sort of evasion to get your creatures past this, because it's not the sort of thing that comes up every once in a while. It's the sort of thing that comes up frequently. So if you can't beat a 3/3 with your aggro deck, you should go back to the drawing board. Next, the threat of exhaust is part of the value. So if you have a card like Hazard of the Dunes, it's a 4-mana 4/4 trample reach, and that exhaust ability is quite expensive at 7 mana. But part of the power of the card is that you don't actually have to activate it to get the benefit. If you attack your opponent and they have a 5/5 and you have 7 mana available, they can't just block your Hazard of the Dunes because you just activate the ability and then their 5/5 would be dead. So if you have your Hazard of the Dunes, make sure you make full advantage of the fact that exhaust has benefits just by existing on the card. Send in your creature with the attack before combat if that's something you're trying to do, and then do whatever you want to do after combat, because you don't actually have to activate the Hazard of the Dunes in order to get that value from that exhaust. And the same thing applies to all of the exhaust abilities in the set, especially the ones that boost stats. The threat of activation activation is absolutely huge with these cards. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it to the end, leave hashtag #ReadySetDraft in the comment section down below, because hopefully you feel more prepared for your next event. That's going to do it for this one, though. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.